If you're familiar with pastels, you would probably know that they can be messy, they can smudge easily, it can be hard to get details, and it can be quite pricey. But it doesn't have to be that way. If you're just getting started with pastels or you're looking for some tips to improve your pastel artwork, in this video I'll go through my top tips I have for working with pastels. I'm Kirsty Rebecca and I make drawing and painting tutorials that are easy to follow even if you're just starting out. The first tip is to prevent smudging. So while you're working on your artwork, try and work from the top left to the bottom right if you can. But if you work in layers like I do rather than sections at a time, you may want to use a different approach, which would be to use glassine or a piece of paper to rest your hand on. So I like to use the glassine because it's see-through, which means I can see the artwork underneath, but you can use any paper that you have around. Just make sure that you place that on top of your artwork and rest your hand on there. And then when you need to move the glassine or the paper, make sure that you lift it up rather than drag it across the piece to avoid the smudging. And this way you won't get any pastel on your hand and you won't smudge any of the pastel onto any other areas of the artwork while you're working. So once you're finished with your drawing, a good way to prevent smudging when you're storing it is to either wrap it in some glassine or store it inside some acid-free tracing paper pads. So that's what I do. I have a few different size pads of tracing paper that I place my artwork in between each sheet, and that way the artwork is all contained in one place. It stays flat and I can easily open the tracing paper pad and remove the artwork if I need to, or if I sell it or want to frame it or anything like that. Whereas if you wrap it in glassine, it's a little bit harder to actually see the artwork if you need to. So I think the tracing paper pad is a great option to store your artwork. And I actually keep mine inside these Alex drawers from IKEA. So these drawers are exactly A2 sized. So you can get 2 pads of A3 tracing paper in there, or you can actually just put an A2 size in there, depending on how big your artwork is. And then if I do any artwork that is slightly bigger than A2 size, I will actually wrap it in glassine, and then I just store it in between some large foam board sheets. And then I just sit them on top of a wardrobe or some shelves so that they stay flat as well. So the next tip is about transferring your outline. I've done this so many times where I have done my outline in graphite or used like a graphite transfer paper. And because graphite has kind of a shine to it, even when you erase it with a kneaded eraser to try and lift up some of the outline, sometimes it can still blend in with the pastel and create a muddy effect, especially if you're working on light colored subjects. So if you're wanting to freehand your artwork, I wouldn't recommend drawing straight onto your pastel paper with graphite, because depending on the paper that you're using, it can be really difficult to fix mistakes or like remove any graphite, and it can really damage some papers. So what I recommend doing to get your outline down is either print out your reference photo if you're going to trace over it, or do your freehand drawing on a separate piece of paper, like a cheaper paper like printer paper or drawing paper, and then you can turn that reference photo or your drawing over and rub pastel on the back of it. So you can use pastel pencil or soft pastel sticks, or you can use pan pastel. And then turn the reference or your drawing the right way up on top of your surface that you're going to be working on, and then trace over that. And that way the pastel that's on the back of that will imprint onto your chosen drawing surface, and you'll end up with an outline that is pastel based, which will blend in with your next few layers of pastel rather than muddying up your colors if you had like a graphite or transfer paper there. You can also use a color that matches your artwork, or you can use a lighter color or darker color depending on the paper that you chose as well. So it's a really great way to get your outline down. The next tip is about reducing the mess or the dust that falls off of your pastel artwork. So there are 2 parts to this. The first is your materials. So I highly recommend using the Clairefontaine pastel mat as the surface for your pastel drawings, because with your generic papers labeled as pastel paper, it can be really quite grainy and you can't get many layers on those papers, but they also tend to not grip onto the pastel as much as pastel mat does, which means that there's a lot of dust fall off. And with the supplies that I use, not a lot of dust falls off in comparison to using soft pastel sticks on a generic pastel paper. So the 2 main pastel supplies that I use for my artwork are pan pastels and pastel pencils. And these are both great because you can control how much pastel you're actually laying down with both of these. So if you don't know what pan pastels are, they're basically a soft pastel that's been compressed into a pan. I've got a lot of tutorials on my YouTube channel about pan pastels, so I'll leave a link in the description to a couple of videos that I think you might find useful if you want to know more about pan pastels. But when you work with both of these supplies, With your pan pastels, you actually apply them with a tool, so you don't touch the pastel at all. And then with your pencils, you're obviously holding the pencil and not touching the pastel. So both of those supplies can be a really great way to control how much pastel you're putting on your piece, so there's less dust that's going to fall off. And also you don't actually have to touch the pastel, so it's less messy on your hands and your general working area as well. The second part to this is making sure that you blend in between each layer. So I usually blend all my pastel works with cotton tips or Q-tips, but you can use a blending stump if you prefer. But blending in between each layer pushes that pigment into the tooth of the paper, so it stops a lot of that pastel dust fall off. So to reduce the mess and the general dust that falls off, you can use the Clairefontaine pastel mat surface with pan pastels and pastel pencils and blend with cotton tips. The next tip is about covering large areas with pastel. So I highly recommend using the pan pastel for larger areas because it's much quicker and easier. The tools that you get with your pan pastels, or the tools that you can buy with them, are called soft tools. That's SOFT, and they come in a huge range of different sizes, so you can get some really quite large sponges that you can use to apply this pastel to larger areas. So as you could imagine, this would be much quicker than using pastel pencils to try and cover that same larger area. Before I share my next tip that will save you some money, if you want to follow along with my longer real-time tutorials where I talk you through every step of the process, then Patreon might be the solution for you. For a small amount per month, you'll have access to every tutorial that I've previously uploaded on your chosen tier level in a variety of mediums like pastel, coloured pencil, graphite, watercolour and more. You will also have access to the original reference photo, a traceable outline, and a list of supplies that I'm using, so you really can follow along every step of the way. My tutorials don't skip any stages or cut out any important parts of the process, and I will share all of my secrets to help you improve. Every month, I will upload brand new tutorials to the library so you can grow and develop your drawing and painting skills and take your art to the next level. You can also join in on our members chat group where you can ask questions or advice or share your artwork and talk to other members in the Patreon community. The link is in the description if you want to check it out. So my next tip is about saving you some money. So I recommend that you buy pan pastels. And I know that sounds counterproductive, but I promise you this will save you money in the long run. So I know that I've mentioned pan pastels quite a bit throughout this video, but hear me out because I know that when you're starting out with pastels, it can seem really expensive because when you look at other artists, they have hundreds of different pastel sticks and different kind of pastel supplies. But the reason that I recommend pan pastels instead of soft pastel sticks is because I've had the same set of pan pastels for years and I've done over 100 pastel drawings, and the only color that I'm almost running out of is the white, and I've still got about a quarter of that left. The rest are still going strong and they look like they're almost brand new. So when you look at the cost of pastel pencils in Australia, pastel pencils range between about $3 and $7 each depending on the brand, whereas pan pastels are $10 each, but they have so much more pastel in the pans, and the pastel sticks can range really widely in price depending on the brand and where you get them from and everything as well. So according to the Pan Pastel website, the pans contain 40% more than an average pastel stick and yield at least 4 to 5 times more coverage. And if you think about how much pastel is inside a pencil, for example, in comparison to a stick, there is heaps more pastel in a stick than there is inside a pencil. And then when you compare the stick to a pan pastel, there's actually 40% more in a pan pastel than there is in a stick. So pan pastels are a little expensive to buy individually to start out with. So if you can't afford a large set of pan pastels, you can actually buy the pure colors, which come in a set of 5, 10 or 20, and you can mix those colors to create any color that you want. So I'll leave a link in the description to a video that shows you how you can mix those 5 colors to make any color. But basically this can save you a lot of money because you only need to buy 5 colors to start with. You don't need an entire set of pastel sticks. And with these sticks, you can't actually blend them very well, which is why you see pastel artists with so many different sets of pastels and different colors, like hundreds of different colors of pastels. But in reality, if you just start with 5 pan pastels, you can mix any color that you need. So basically, now that I've confused you with all the numbers, my point is that you want to try and save your pastel pencils for the detail layers where you really need something smaller to get in those textures and details, and use the pan pastels for larger areas like backgrounds or the base layers to your subjects. And that will save you a lot of money in the long run. The next tip is to tape down your artwork while you're working on it. So I tape all my work down with masking tape or scotch tape. So that way there's a clean edge around the outside of my piece that I can use to hold the piece when I'm moving it around or trying to store it or frame it or anything like that. Because that way you have a nice little border around the outside that you can hold on to instead of having to touch your pastel artwork. And if you sell your artwork and you're posting it in the mail, not framed, when your customer receives it and opens it up and there's this nice little clean border around the outside, it just looks a lot nicer in my opinion as well. The next tip is don't press too hard. So the harder you press on your pastel, the more pastel will come off and fill up the tooth of the paper. So basically, if you don't know what the tooth is, every paper that you work on has like little hills and valleys, little grooves in the paper. So your pastel catches on the top of the hills and deposits into the valleys, and then once you've filled up the valleys with your pastel or your pigment, it becomes a smooth, even surface that's in line with the top of the hills, and that means there's nothing for your pastel to grip onto anymore, which means that you can't add any more layers. And when you're working on pastel in particular, you can fill up the tooth of the paper quite quickly. So if you work in light layers and blend your pastel in between each layer with a cotton tip, that will help push the pigment into the tooth of the paper, and it will allow you to add more layers on top as well. So you want to just build up light layers so that you have enough tooth to work with when you get to your detail layer. And it doesn't matter what paper you're working on, even if you're working on the pastel mat, there will still be a point where you can't add any more layers because you've filled up the tooth. So just keep in mind that you do have a limit to how many layers you can add. So the way that I do it is that I do a base layer where I block in my main colors, and I'm not adding any detail at this point because it's going to smudge out anyway. And then I'll add in another 1 or 2 layers where I'm starting to work on the textures and the values, and then I'll probably do one more layer where I'll add in the details or any finer areas that I want to include. So I don't usually add too many layers of pastel, so you do want to keep that in mind when you're working with pastel, that if you're used to working in colored pencil, for example, you won't be able to get as many layers with pastel as you do with colored pencil. So you want to make sure that you're working with a light hand all the way through and blending out in between each layer. So the next tip is creating white highlights or really bright colors. So sometimes you get to a point where you've filled up the tooth of the paper, or your pastel pencils just aren't as bright as you want them to be, or you're really struggling to get in those really bright highlights or whiskers towards the end. So I usually work with the Pan Pastels and then 2 different brands of pastel pencil, which are the Stabilo Carbothello and the Faber-Castell Pitt Pastel. And those 2 pastel pencils are quite hard in comparison to a lot of pastels. So sometimes if you use a softer pastel like the Caran d'Ache pastel pencils or like a soft pastel stick, I usually use the Rembrandt for that. You can usually use those softer pastels to create brighter highlights where your harder pastels just won't get that brightness. So if you get to the end of your piece and you're really struggling to get the whites really white, or you really want a bright color somewhere, try the Caran d'Ache pastel pencils or the soft pastel sticks on top. The Caran d'Ache pastel pencils are quite expensive though, and they are really soft, so they crumble a little bit easier. So I usually only use those at the end if I'm looking for like a really bright highlight or a really dark shadow, and my normal Faber-Castell or the Stabilo pencils just won't get those highlights or shadows. The next tip is to use a toned paper. So I really like working on a mid-tone paper because it's easier to see your values, so it's easier to see how dark or how light you're going. Whereas if you start on a white piece of paper, anything that is mid-tone or dark will just look really dark in comparison to the white. And I found that when I work on white paper, sometimes I end up going back and darkening up areas that I thought were dark to start with against the white of the paper, but turns out they weren't actually that dark when I get towards the end of my piece. So by starting out with a toned paper, it'll be easier to see whether your values are right. And it's also easier because you can add light colors and dark colors on there. So obviously when you're working on a white paper, you can't add white to the white paper because it won't show up. Whereas if you're working on toned paper, you can add light colors and dark colors, so it can be a little bit easier to work that way as well. And the next tip is about sharpening your pastel pencils. So if you've ever tried to sharpen a pastel pencil, you would know that they crumble quite easily. It's very hard to get a sharp point on them, and they make your sharpeners blunt quite quickly. So since I've started working with pastels, I've done quite a bit of research and I've trialed a lot of different sharpeners that people have recommended to me. So 2 of the most popular sharpeners that people recommend to me are the manual crank handle sharpeners. So there's 2 brands, the Derwent Superpoint Mini and the Swordfish, and they're both very similar. They work great to start with, and then the blades get blunt after about 3 months or so. So these sharpeners have replacement blades that you can buy. So if you can get access to them in your country for a reasonable price, and then that may be the way to go. But in Australia, I can't even get access to them. So for me, I have to buy a new sharpener every 3 months, which is kind of a ridiculous waste of money, to be honest. And even when the sharpener did work, I still found that I was losing a lot of my pastel inside the sharpener. It did break quite a lot anyway, and I continuously have to open my sharpener, clean it all out, find the broken pastel inside and wedge it out, and run graphite pencils through the sharpener to try and keep the blade sharper for longer, and just all sorts of things to try and get my sharpener to do the job of a sharpener. For me, it was just such a waste of time and money. And even if you do manage to get a really fine point on your pastel pencil with those sharpeners, it tends to crumble as soon as you start working with it, or the point wears away quite quickly anyway, so you end up having to resharpen the pastel pencil numerous times throughout your project and wasting a lot of pastel inside your sharpener. So I've basically come to the conclusion that the best way to sharpen pastel pencils is with a craft knife or a blade, and so I literally just shave away the wooden casing on the outside of the pencil, and then I use it like that for my entire project. If I really need fine details at any point, you can just use some sandpaper. I've got one that I got from an art shop, but you can just use one from a hardware store, and you just sand the point until you get a fine enough point that you're after for that area that you're working on. But I honestly sharpen my pencil this way once at the beginning of my project, and it will usually last the entire project without me having to resharpen my pencil. So a lot of people say that it's really time consuming to sharpen with a blade, but I really disagree with that. Once you get used to how the blade works, it's really quick to actually sharpen the pencil, and you don't have to sharpen it again for the entire project. The point that you get on the pastel pencil by sharpening it this way is perfect for me to do the amount of detail that I get in my pastel drawings, because you can kind of rotate the pencil and then use an edge if you need to get a sharper point throughout any part of your process. And then again, if you did need a really fine point, like sometimes if I'm signing the piece, I want a bit of a finer point, and then I'll use the sandpaper, but I rarely ever use the sandpaper anyway. So by sharpening it this way, I get to use the entire pastel inside of my pencil. So I'm not wasting any money, and I'm also not wasting time, because once I've sharpened it, that's it. So I hope some of these tips were useful for you. So I've got a playlist on the screen of some other pastel tutorials that I thought you might find useful, so click on that and I'll see you over there.